As those of you among my audience with functioning grey matter may have surmised, I'm English. Ah yes, the jolly old United Kingdom. Ah, a sparkling paradise of an island to be sure. Full of wonderful classic dishes like fish and chips, beans on toast, and who could forget, bangers and mash. And adding to our vast collection of foods, unimaginable wealth, national icons and celebrities, we also have our own distinctive comedic style. Bringing the patriotism and hyperbole down and instead talking like an actual human being with a heartbeat and a pulse instead of a walking, talking propaganda film for a minute. British humour and sensibilities when it comes to our media has always been an interesting topic to me, especially when comparing it to our strange cousins over in the land of chain gangs and Thanksgivings. English humour tends to be more cynical, pessimistic, and dedicated to putting down the common man with a large helping of mundanity and the occasional cruelty of reality. Contrast that with the comparatively young and more idealistic United States, whose media most prominently follows idealistic story structures like the hero's journey, and focuses the perspective of its narratives on a character which could usually be described as an underdog, who starts off from a low place but at the end reaches a new and comparatively and seemingly better equilibrium. This is a subject I find very interesting if you can't already tell. I think the vast difference between the two countries' sense of storytelling stems primarily from their age. Much as the case for actual people, the younger you are, the more idealistic and hopeful you are, surrounding yourself in escapism and fantasy, whereas when you're older, your roots are more firmly planted in the soil of reality, losing your youthful optimism and suspension of disbelief, being more jaded and bitter and finding humour in the factual instead of fantastical. I feel like a broken record with the amount of times I feel like I've said this, but what I'm saying is obviously a generalisation. To imply that all American media is optimistic, whereas all English media is pessimistic, is debatable at best and untrue at worst. However, I would still stand by my belief that this is a generalisation that is rooted by strong evidence found when examining each country's film industry. Looking at popular American film, for example, during a decade like the 80s, you tend to see the same reoccurring trends and storytelling used in these films, which were, like I said earlier, usually focused on an underdog who manages to go from zero to hero within a 2-hour runtime. Fantastical and otherworldly plots, or ones that had an implicit or even unintentional reverence for the American idea. Mainly brought about by the idea of the American dream reignited by Reagan during the decade, which promoted pride in one's country and the promise of going from nothing to being a success through faith in American values, democracy and economy. Switch to England in the same period and you had recession, Thatcher and the Falklands, as well as a near nationwide criticism and lack of faith in the country they lived in. When you see modern lookbacks at the 80s, in American media you see booming industry, fashion, iconic hairstyles and clothing, pride in democracy and the evolution of the American dream. Whereas in something like This Is England, the 80s is presented as a time of strife and hardship, following a young boy being radicalised by a popular anti-establishment group after having lost his father in a pointless war his government waged for land. But nothing speaks more to anyone's sensibilities, politics and history than when it comes to comedy. Most American comedy shows I've seen tend to adhere to the storytelling trends I've laid out in this video one way or the other. They often follow underdogs who start off the series being down at the bottom but gradually work their way up and end up gaining something at the end. Or if not, they usually centre around the fantastical and the promotion of suspending disbelief. However, British comedy is nearly the complete and total opposite, and in no show is that more evident than Peep Show. Peep Show is a, you guessed it, British sitcom created by Jesse Armstrong and Sam Bain. The show began its broadcast in 2003 on Channel 4 and gained the reputation of being one of the most acclaimed English sitcoms in the last 20 years. Now, as for the actual plot and premise of Peep Show, it follows two London roommates, Mark Corrigan and Jeremy Usborne. One of them is a straight-edged, uptight and nervous office worker who's pining for a co-worker of his, and the other is a lazy, layabout wannabe musician who wants to break into the music industry. If you're already disregarding the show as it sounds like a regurgitation of already existing and tired comedy beats and story tropes, then shut that lip. Everything is a regurgitation of something that has already been done, and in the genre of comedy, similarities and parallels are bound to be apparent. Going back to a recent video of mine, it could be argued that Zach Hadel's visual style is just a less refined version of John Kay's art style, whereas comedic style is nothing more than a repetition of gags pioneered in shows like Seinfeld or comedians like Norm Macdonald. But it's not the presence of tropes that makes something bad or unspecial, it's their execution. The lazy, go-with-the-flow slacker being paired with a straight man isn't anything new, but Peep Show manages to make this setup interesting and distinct with the addition of a neat filmmaking gimmick and some trademark British cynicism. Perhaps the most glaring part of Peep Show's visual style is its camera. Every shot in Peep Show is filmed from a character's point of view, whether that be from one of the main cast like Mark or Jeremy, or a random background extra. It's a technique that you often see used in shows that thrive on awkwardness for its comedy. Other than Peep Show, a standout example would be The Office, which is shot with the intent of being part of a documentary series about a regular office in Slough. The intent of the filmmakers and the writers is to make you feel like you're occupying that space, that you're not just an outside person looking in, but rather the impartial cameraman who is first-hand witnessing all the events taking place in the office.
Can't you discipline him?
Oh, kinky! No.
The term cringe gets thrown around a lot these days, especially on the internet, but the reason it's so popular in comedy is that it's something that everyone can understand due to our innate human empathy. Story time. I was on the voice channel on Mauler's Discord server once, and who should appear but Rags? Hello. It was all chill, everyone was having a relaxed time, but then this guy joined and awkwardly asked Rags if he read a DM that he sent him, after Rags had replied, no. The guy tried to save face by saying, oh, don't worry about it, it is nothing, like, you don't even have to read it, you know, it's not a big deal or anything, it's a slight whatever. That whole interaction gave me so much secondhand embarrassment for that guy. There were about 20 or so people on that call, all listening in on him trying to talk to a YouTuber he obviously really liked and respected. And he was obviously very invested in Rags seeing the DM he sent him, so when Rags replied, no, the guy tried to make it seem as though he was as disinterested and lax about it as the person he respected, which resulted in an awkward and uncomfortable attempt to save face. I found it embarrassing for him at the time, but I also found it incredibly funny, because everyone has had a moment like that at some point in their lives. Everybody knew what that guy's real feelings were, and everyone had their innate empathy and understanding for a situation. And I don't know about you, but when it comes to awkward humour, the closer it hits to home, the funnier. And that's the kind of humour Peep Show thrives on, and the first person perspective makes it all the easier for you, as the audience, to relate to Mark and Jez. Everyone knows what it's like to be forced to be nice to someone you think is awful.
What do you think of her? Honestly.
I think she might have a borderline personality disorder. I think she's lovely.
Everyone knows on some level what it's like to be in a situation that is way out of your comfort zone.
This guy is literally a moron.
You're on it, man. We're on it. We're brothers.
Yeah.
Oh god, the sweaty grip of the moron.
And you're either a liar or a psycho if you don't relate to trying to save face after something someone's done to you or someone else.
You're not going? No. Obviously, yeah, you must go.
See you later, Jez.
See you later, Mrs. Osborne. Health club interview. It's a biggie. Really hope she gets it. Anyway, on with the wedding.
You know Mark and Jeremy incredibly well through these experiences and perspectives, feeling like you know them as well as you know yourself, mainly because of the relatability gained through your own life experiences, but also through their thoughts. In addition to giving us a peek into what they're seeing, we also get a peek into what they're thinking as well, with moments of awkward silence filled up by the inner monologues of Mark and Jeremy, which is a vital component of why certain jokes work so well, as without them, what would have been intended as a joke instead becomes a weird moment or something you'd assume was just an outtake left in.
Shit, what if they bring in forensics?
Oh, hell, I probably shouldn't have done that, should I? My prints will be all over it now.
As I said at the beginning of the video, Britain is an old country that finds more joy laughing at its reality than it does anything that seems otherworldly or unrealistic. Peep Show situations and humour aren't derived from any wacky or bizarre setups. Often its episodes are about things that an average person would dismiss as being too mundane of an occurrence, like having to go to a job interview or performing jury duty. Even things that lean a bit more towards something that isn't regular are usually treated as something that you could see happening in reality, and have realistic consequences and even relatability. Sophie. In the season 2 episode, Jeremy Makes It, Mark makes a new friend at work called Darren, which is incredibly rare for Mark, and in the episode you see him come out of his shell a lot more, having his dynamic with Jeremy be shifted slightly.
That's not funny, Daryl. Repeat, not funny.
Oh, come on, lads. Let's lose the cone.
But since this is a British sitcom, it doesn't turn out to be a nice thing, revealing that Mark's new friend is actually a neo-Nazi.
Yeah, the traffic, the noise, the hassle.
Car alarms, the cash points, the blacks, the packies, the Jews.
Not a lot of people can say that they've made a close friend who turned out to be in possession of a copy of Mein Kampf, but a lot of people can say they've met people who they were friendly to initially, but as they've gotten to know them, they discover that they've got some yikes beliefs, values, or tendencies that you find to be not good.
No, because I was in a tent with him for ages and we talked for a long time, and it was mostly on racial classifications, head measurements, and so on.
Wow.
Which is the exact circumstance Mark is put in, but having Darren be a racist and nothing more would make the conflict seem too black and white. Darren is bad because he's a Nazi, and Mark is not, therefore he's in the right. It's funnier and more awkward to have there be more complexity to the conflict, like Mark only being able to confront Darren when behind soundproofing and in a glass window, which is a pretty cowardly way to cut someone off. Despite Darren having abhorrent views, he's probably one of the most stable people in the show. Darren is comfortable in his own skin, unlike Mark, and even after being betrayed by him, he still decides to stick by him in the end.
Listen, don't worry, I'm not going to embarrass you, right? I'm going now. I just wanted to say, I don't care what happened, I still think you're a bloody good guy. So, well, I'll see you around, mate.
Yeah, and good riddance, you fucking Nazi!
English comedy seems to love that, presenting the illusion of the characters receiving a happy outcome or making the good choice, but having them end the episode either the same or worse off than they were at the beginning, which is particularly exemplified in Peep Show's 4th season. Peep Show is not a show that prides or structures itself around an overarching plot. Most of the episodes are self-contained and made to be easily rewatchable and friendly for Channel 4 to rerun. There is still some kind of through line or cohesive narrative linking each episode of a season together though. In season 2 was Jeremy's relationship with Nancy, which was set up at the beginning of the season and then concluded at the end of it. But there wasn't a series-wide arc that wasn't constantly developed or progressed. Or was there? At the beginning of the show, one of the first things we find out about Mark is his infatuation for his co-worker Sophie, and every episode in the initial 4 seasons of Peep Show that I can think of is at least somewhat related to this little beat, with the writers using it as a springboard to create stories for Mark which are otherwise unrelated to Sophie. But despite the show being more interested in using Sophie and Mark's relationship for comedic mileage, the dynamic between the two of them did develop through each season. Season 1 is Mark obsessing over Sophie and being infatuated with her from afar. Season 2 has Sophie get with Jeff, forcing Mark into using underhanded tactics to try and separate the two of them by any means necessary.
Jesus Christ!
Oh, Jez, don't worry about this. I'm not actually cutting myself. I just need to convince Sophie I'm desperate, and obviously I need some evidence.
And in season 3, Mark actually manages to start a romantic relationship with her, which ends up throwing a wrench in the cliché and overly oiled mechanism that is the typical romantic subplot for sitcoms like Peep Show. In both versions of The Office, for example, you have a character who is hopelessly in love with a co-worker who's already in a relationship with a dickhead that we hate and want to see die. And by the end of the series, we'd ideally want to see the main character get with his co-worker and live a happy life. And Peep Show subverts this concept by having the two of them actually get together, but having it result in their relationship becoming much worse than it ever was before. You're the dickhead, Mark. You're the dickhead. Which is a pretty all-encompassing word you could use when describing any character in Peep Show. Mark and Jeremy are not nice people. Jez is incredibly immature and someone who will do anything to avoid his responsibilities, even if it means hurting other people to get what he wants. Although that sentence does make him sound more vindictive than he actually is, admittedly. Jez's actions are more rooted in stupidity and an inability to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions in the long term, instead thinking about what will happen in the short term. Mark, on the other hand, is someone who's more self-conscious but to a fault. In social situations, he tries overly hard to blend in him with normal people and overanalyzes every possible situation he's put in. A lot of Mark's decisions are dictated by whether or not he thinks it would make him look good or live up to his idea of being proper. The entire reason he got engaged to Sophie in the first place is out of embarrassment of her finding the engagement ring before he could break things off with her. And unlike Jeremy, Mark's actions are not out of a lack of understanding of his actions or consequence, but instead out of deliberate malice. Getting a guy fired from his job because he knows that Mark doesn't want to get married and being cruel to his co-workers for not living up to his high standards.
And I was quite shocked when you called Kathy a knucklehead, Mark.
No, I didn't.
Yes, you did. You said she was a knucklehead and she should knuckle down or you'd knuckle her fat head. And then you stamped on Gerard's foot.
That was an accident.
No, it wasn't.
It could have been. I was careful to be sure that it could have been.
Mark in season 4 is too cowardly and greedy to try and break things off with Sophie until the wedding day, making what to her was going to be one of the best days of her life into what was probably one of the worst days of her life. Despite how morbid that specific episode sounds, it's actually probably the best episode in all of Peep Show, playing the cringe factor up to the highest level and forcing you to really stay in the headspace of a dead man walking who is terrified of getting married, going to any degree possible to get out of his marriage so long as he's not the one who does it. The episode could have potentially served as the finale for Peep Show the creators wanted, giving it a scale that could never be surpassed without jumping the shark, and presenting a typically Peep Show bitter end to Sophie and Mark's relationship for good, as well as expanding on Jeremy and Mark's relationship and how they need each other more than they need themselves. Every part of the episode is completely reliant on its audience having context for these two. I think if you showed this episode to someone who hadn't seen Peep Show before, they probably would not derive much enjoyment from it. You need to know who Mark is and why he does what he does, what put him in this position and why the final moment with Jeremy is so significant. Peep Show scenarios only get its comedy so far, instead being driven by Mark and Jez, their dynamic as well as their inner thoughts, actions and perspective, and the show's format gives you a unique and intimate way of experiencing that perspective. But that does still carry on after season 4 of Peep Show, but in my opinion it went way downhill after the wedding. I don't want to talk too much about the seasons after 4 as this video is as bloated as it is, but they make up the majority of this show, so I guess I'll state some of my thoughts on the seasons following the wedding. Season 5 was decent, with a rocky first episode which was not at all a good follow-up to the bombshell to the status quo that was Mark and Sophie's wedding. As I said earlier, Mark and Sophie's relationship was the driving force for Peep Show's plot, and with the annulment of that relationship, the show felt a lot more lost, choosing to try and fill that gap with a character that, while a better fit for Mark, was not nearly as likeable, endearing and relatable as Sophie. Season 5 tried to return back to formula in a way. It still talked about and dealt with the wedding, but for the most part it tried to go back to what it did before, by just having Mark and Jeremy get up to shenanigans. However, I think the writers quickly realised that JLB wasn't going to be the best setting for episodes now, given how much the last season would have shook up that entire workplace and changed the balance of everything that was established. And without Sophie, there wasn't really much story potential aside from the occasional thing with Dobby, which would have been much harder to insert naturally into the story given that her and Mark work in completely different sectors of JLB. So to fix that issue, in the first episode of season 6, they sunk that bitch like the Titanic so they could get more of a fresh start and separate themselves from the formula of the previous seasons. And did they?
Chance would be a fine thing.
Yes and no. In terms of differentiating themselves and making something new, they succeeded. But that formula worked for a reason. It was reliable, kept the show cohesive and balanced character dynamics excellently. Johnson, Jeff, Sophie, Nancy and Superhands were all supporting characters that fit and added something interesting to both Mark and Jeremy. Nancy mirrored Jeremy's more hippie and adventurous side, but it also showed how Jeremy, despite what he says, has limits and things that make him uncomfortable, and her religious and charitable side served in direct contrast with Jez's selfishness and lack of commitment, which is why that relationship ultimately ends. What does Elena highlight or challenge about Jeremy other than that she's sexual and a little bit stupid? Same goes for Zara, April, Megan and Joe. They work nowhere near as well as Sophie or Nancy. Dobby was probably the best new character introduced in the show, mirroring a lot of Mark's eccentricities but also challenged Mark's morality. However, like I said, I found her nowhere near as likeable or successful writing wise as Sophie, but I do admire the thought put into her at least, aside from her being Mark's love interest. It is important to state though that I don't find these seasons to be bad. There are a lot of standout and funny moments still. At points it feels like classic Peep Show, whereas at others it feels like a headless chicken running around aimlessly, bouncing off of story beats and love interest like it's nothing. Remember when Mark had an accidental son with Sophie following a one-night stand, creating what is possibly one of the best character moments for Mark in the whole series? Well, the writers sure did, because Mark's son is barely brought up following the episode and makes one appearance in one part during the worst season. Which is is fine. There isn't really much wrong with it. It's just boring and chooses to divert its focus away from characters you'd like to see make one final appearance and concluded, and chooses instead to focus on two boring love triangles with white bread nothing characters. The series ends with a very English, bleak and bittersweet ending of Mark and Jez sitting down in the living room, talking to each other and realising that they're in the exact same position they were in at the beginning of the show. Which was nice, but it was already done much better 5 seasons prior. I do want to preface once more that this rant isn't me saying why the last few seasons are bad or anything. I think they're fine, serviceable, and even had a lot of great and memorable moments. But I do think it became directionless and lost the spark and guerrilla style that made the first 4 seasons so great. But despite that, I would still say that Peep Show, when looked at as a whole, is still one of the best comedies ever made, and is the perfect example of what I would deem to be peak British comedy. Finding humour in the world we live in, even in the boring parts, with next to no over-the-top scenarios being utilised to aid its comedy, instead playing on awkwardness and mundanity. I've called this show miserable before, and I don't mean that in the same way I would when describing someone like BoJack Horseman. Other than dogs being killed, discarded, burnt and then eaten, Peep Show has very little content that I would call shocking or that puts me into a funk. I call it miserable because it reminds me of the real world. A lot of people view comedy and entertainment to be escapism that gets your mind off whatever's going on in your life. Your job, your anxieties, the wince-worthy thing you said to a colleague, and your concerns over whether or not you're getting a good deal on something you're investing in. I'd say that a lot of American comedy fills that void because it's a country built on that ideal, that everything will get better and that you're in the land of opportunity, and that's reflected in its media. Whereas England is the opposite. Watching the UK office will remind you of everything you hate about your day job, but the US office shows you a place that you'd like to work in. I'm not saying that either is good nor bad for the record. A country's media is emblematic of a lot of things in its culture and also a major influence on its population. And if the depression rate in England is anything to go by, the prevalence of misery in comedy may not be the best contributor to the life of the average working Joe. But for me personally, it's a sense of humour I enjoy, much like I've enjoyed making this video. So, thanks for watching. This was initially planned to be a much shorter video, which mutated into a much longer one. I've been trying to be more consistent with uploads on this channel, but given how this is quite a stressful time academically, this whole situation has to take a backseat. But I'm getting close to 100 subscribers, so PewDiePie better start watching his ass, because I'm coming for him. And if you want to aid in this noble fight, then subscribe to my channel. Comment your thoughts and share this video and others with anyone who you think would be interested. Have a good one, and goodbye.